It took another decade to get to the February Revolution because they entered World War I with the Trumpian Kaiser Wilhelm, and the people had had enough, and they removed the Tsar from power and they created a republic, although it was very weak and inefficient, as most new governments are. While the Duma was weak, the Socialists had over the past decade organized Soviets or local grassroots governments similar to the old peasant communes or villages of the feudal era, just self-ruled instead of ruled by a lord. It was originally direct democracy, but over time that was eroded, being essentially abandoned by the Tsar as all the resources in the nation was going toward the war and a stupid monarchistic family feud. These Soviets essentially set up their own version of the Paris Commune. In the cities, their Soviets were the local trade unions for factories and businesses that used mutual aid, just like the rural Soviets. The Duma could have been successful with power sharing between the Socialists and the Liberal Republicans, except because of the financial pressures from the debts, they decided to continue the war. Also, there was still extreme nationalism, and they blamed all the problems on the Tsar, and they argued that a liberal government could run a better war than the Tsar. This turned out to be very wrong. This was the entire catalyst for their successful revolution in the first place, and the people weren't having it. Lenin and the Bolsheviks took over in the October Revolution, overthrowing the Duma and putting the power into the hands of the Soviets. This is actually a repost of the original video where I acted a little too sympathetic to Lenin. Now that I'm at the end of the revolutionary podcast, I just can't. And he was slightly better than the Tsars before him, but unlike all the other socialist parties at the time, the Bolsheviks was in essence a cult of Lenin, as we'll discuss in the next video. He originally was part of the Democratic Socialist Party, but then due to a petty rift of his own ego, kicked out anyone who disagreed with him, and the party now became the Bolsheviks, while the people he kicked out became the Mensheviks. Agreeing with Lenin and voting the way he wanted became one of the core features of being a Bolshevik, and Stalin just carried on this tradition to its logical conclusion. Lenin's first act was to seize and redistribute the lands of the aristocracy and the Orthodox Church, which made up the majority of Russian lands, and gave them to the people. He had wanted to collectivize them, but needed the support of the people, and to do so needed to legalize what peasants had already been doing during the war. He also temporarily suspended some newspapers he deemed counter-revolutionary, something even other Bolsheviks decried as an assault on freedom of the press. But with all the counterattacks by the White Army and anti-socialist propaganda by outside forces, he had also ended the death penalty, but then with the constant resistance of the White Army and the Don Cossacks, who had been the brutal muscle of the Tsar that had suppressed them for centuries as mercenaries, no longer having any income, Lenin felt the only way to stop them, as they would never just live peacefully and accept the new way of doing things without a king, was to reinstate the death penalty, and boy did they, at a rate still unknown, but the best estimates were around 28,000 per year for the 5 years he ruled. The modern-day right decries Lenin as bloody and a monster because of the number of people he killed per year. What they ignore completely is that this is not done in a vacuum, and the 17 years prior, Tsar Nicholas killed around 52,000 a year in his reign, including pogroms against Jews encouraged by the crown. While the Russian Civil War killed some 7 to 12 million people, it did help end World War I, which killed around 9 to 15 million people. Just some context, folks. War is hell, and by today's standards, in a vacuum, Lenin was a horrible man. But by compared to what came before him, he was a downright nice guy and was hoping to get to the point where they could abolish the death penalty. Stalin, on the other hand, was a monster, who was only beat in terms of mass murder by Nicholas's grandfather, who massacred Jews and Tatars by the millions. Stalin's legacy is what killed the USSR in the long term. It never became what Lenin hoped, though they did reach a certain level of prosperity, which many old Russians remember fondly under Brezhnev. Lenin also allowed all ethnic groups to form their own nations and break away from Russia, which many did, including Poland and Finland. But many, such as the Balkans, broke off and formed their own socialist nations and joined the USSR, similar to US states. The first 5 years of the USSR and their attempts to replicate the American model of democracy is uncanny and not what you were taught about them. They even democratized the military, eliminating ranks and allowing soldiers to vote for their own leaders. They destroyed the old monarchistic courts and laws and replaced them with tribunals and jury of their peers, just like in the US. They established an 8-hour workday, and at the time, business could still operate in the USSR in a capitalist free market system. Lenin established unions in every business, so the workers had equal power as shareholders. FDR would attempt this a decade later, not to kill capitalism, but an attempt to save it, in his opinion, being at most a social democrat and at least a social liberal. Lenin guaranteed secular schools for all children, and nationwide government orphanages, which before orphans had essentially been used as slave labor. They pushed a literacy campaign for all that increased the literacy of the nation by around 5 million people. They established a separation of church and state, just like in the US. Organized religion was illegal, but one was allowed to keep their own faith as they chose, and once the freedom of the press was restored, they would be allowed to publish again. Women were given full rights and autonomy from their husbands, with women's councils set up to establish better equality for the sexes. They also nationalized the banks, the thing the Paris Commune failed to do that ended up getting them slaughtered house by house. So many good things were happening. However, the Bolsheviks only decentralized because it's what was popular, and it was always their intention to heavily centralize once they gained enough power. Upon taking power, Lenin declared the war over. Not the war will be over once we hammer out an agreement, but the war was just over. People began abandoning the front lines and going home, and when Trotsky went to negotiate with the Germans, they had zero bargaining power, so the Germans demanded a terrible deal. Trotsky stalled for time, thinking there was going to be a socialist revolution in Germany that never came. This delay made the Germans angry, and they made the treaty even worse, taking 1/3 of the entire former Russian Empire. This breathing room led to an increase in violence from the Red Army against the people as they got more and more heavy-handed, even suppressing a staged rebellion from the Revolutionary Socialists, or SRs, which was unfortunately meant to just be a demonstration to make the government aware of their discontent. Instead, the Bolshevik government saw it as a coup, doing exactly what they had done, and crushed them. At the beginning, the SRs did get a trial, and no more than a 1-year sentence, but in the early 20s, there was a huge show trial where many used forced confessions under torture and fear for their families' lives, and many were executed on much worse false charges. This heavy-handedness got so bad, the Russians let a battalion of hardened Czech fighters pass through Russian territory and take the train to Siberia and take ships around the world. They would then go and fight on the Western Theater against the Germans. There was confusion in one of the towns one of the trains stopped in, and there was an attempted arrest, and instead these hardened fighters took over the town. Trotsky, now used to using brutality as the norm, just called for all these Czech fighters to be shot, which went as well as you can expect of a poorly trained Red Army unit trying to kill a hardened battle troop, and these Czech troops began seizing town after town along the train line everywhere they stopped. This gave an opening to the former Duma and landowners to stage an army called the White Army, made up of mostly officers, and began forcefully conscripting peasants. Both sides committed atrocities, stole food and supplies, had their ranks filled with corruption and selling stolen goods on the black market, but the White Army was viewed, and definitely worse, because they planned on giving the land back to the lords, without any upside for the peasants. Lenin then initiated war communism, where all trade and free market were banned, and centralized planning became the norm. Money was essentially banned, and people were sent to go around and collect excess food from the rural peasants. Many convinced the peasants were hiding grain. Some were, but most felt like why should they work harder if they didn't reap any of the benefits, so they only grew enough to feed themselves and often then had the food they needed seized from them and starved. There was also rape, extortion, and murder by these agents, but no one to appeal the mistreatment to. When grain came up short, Lenin insisted it was the fault of the kulaks, or land-owning former peasants, and went on a witch hunt, killing many, but available food declined instead of going up, and Lenin ended the persecution of the kulaks. It was at this point that the party began to become more important than the government, and people who were party members got special perks and privileges, including better food and staying in nice hotels and travel paid. Lenin claimed that those who worked hard for the revolution should be rewarded. Instead, it brought a ton of opportunists into the party with no ideology, who used their privilege to extort products from the people and the collective wartime government and sell them on the black market. The whites were no better, if even worse, and Trotsky sent a letter thanking the whites for having so much corruption that they had sold many munitions donated by the Western countries on the black market, which was bought up by the Red Army and gave them superior weapons. The World War ended, and all the land given to the Germans was abandoned by the Germans, as it now belonged to Russia, but since there was no government to replace them, civil war in these areas broke out. Ukraine, most notably, as an anarchist general, Nestor Makhno, was in charge of the anarchist military and was very successful in seizing and by all accounts actually actually liberating much of the country. Sadly, the viewpoints of communists and anarchists were very different, and while Lenin well understood the cities and the proletariat, he had little understanding of peasant agrarian life and what worked there. While Makhno knew well the rural life, but when he helped take over cities, he didn't understand them and hated cities and tried to tell people to barter and abandon money, which didn't work in cities at all. Had anarchism taken over the rural areas and socialists taken over the cities and factories, it could have been a match made in heaven, but instead Lenin stabbed Makhno and the anarchists in the back multiple times. Lenin would back Makhno militarily with weapons and equipment until they did too well and then cut off the supply. With their own land on the line, anarchs fought brutally and with so much more resolve as opposed to the monarchist forces who had zero stake in the fight. In the end, once the war was over, Lenin sent troops in to crush the anarchs and Makhno ended up fleeing and dying in Paris as a broken man. I highly recommend listening to the Behind the Bastards podcast on him for more details. This was their Christmas episode, which is always actually about a good person. This, after the Paris Commune, was the second of 3 European attempts at anarchism, and was of course crushed as well, but this time not by the monarchists but the communists, further dividing the trust between the red and the black forces. The nation was wrecked, it was war-torn, and the little infrastructure they had was mostly destroyed. People were starving in certain areas. Also, the education of the average Russian was at best a 4th grade level, and much of the intelligentsia were loyal to the bourgeois class. So Russia was essentially in the worst-case scenario for a cycle that Marx predicted, but Lenin created marxist-leninism to try and fit as best with Marx that would fit with the material conditions of the time. At this point in history, when the manifesto was written, communism and socialism were considered the same thing, socialism became defined as a political movement to either fill in the gaps of capitalism that Marx brought up, such as social democracy, all the way to being the transition period with an end goal of communism. Communism was considered the end goal of what modern economists call the post-scarcity era, when everything was so cheap from automation that everyone could give according to their ability and take according to their need. No nation we called communist ever called themselves communists. That was a Western term because of the Communist Party, who were pushing the idea forward to juxtapose them with other socialist parties who just wanted to fill in the gaps of capitalism. Finally, as the Civil War was winding down, many loyal soldiers and sailors went home to hear all the horror stories that their families told them and began to stage their own revolutions against the communists, crying all power to the Soviets without communists. Trotsky overwhelmed these patriotic rebels, crushed them with brutal force, murdered those who surrendered, and then painted it all as a foreign plot, and their bravery was purged from the record as them all being just traitors to the revolution. To make matters worse, peasants had been dealing with famines for centuries and had systems to keep food back in case of famine, but because of the food seizures and disincentives to work extra, bad weather led to famine and high levels of cannibalism, leading up to 8 million deaths throughout Russia. This forced Lenin to back off of war communism and open up free markets again for some time, called the New Economic Policy, or NEP, but in exchange banned all other political parties and factions inside the party. They also banned all unions, because if the government was the voice of the proletariat, then there was no need for unions, which allowed the capitalist NEP, or NEP men as they were called, to exploit the workers because they had little bargaining power. China is using the same model today, and they crush any attempts to unionize. This ended up giving Lenin essentially total power, and later Stalin used this party system to seize power and bring back war communism during World War II, and it went just as well as the first time. Basically, all of this brutality and civil war was completely pointless and ended up right back where they started, and up to 11 million people dead from the war and starvation. What I found so shocking when doing research was that I was told that there was no democracy in the USSR. Oddly enough, there was democracy in the Soviet Union, or Union of Soviets, and based heavily on the American model of democracy. But what we had before the Republican Party was bought out by war profiteers and corporate restriction laws were lifted that created the Gilded Age. While we view them as a one-party state, they viewed themselves as a no-party state, hearkening to the words of Washington and attempting to replicate the American era of good feelings between Jefferson and John Quincy Adams, when America had no political parties, but roughly 5 factions within one or no party that were constantly at each other's throats. Anyone could run for representative, and your Soviet or trade union would send that person to represent you in the Duma. However, there was one caveat that ended up leading to serious abuse of power: double representation. Following Jefferson's view that education was essential for democracy to work, and most had little to no formal education, Lenin had the Duma not actually write laws themselves, but instead appointed and vote on experts in their field to run the government in the Politburo. This was meant to be temporary until the population was better educated. Sadly, this ended up creating something of an elitist class of people, and a power grab was made possible due to this supposed to be temporarily weakened level of checks and balances. However, some other things occurred that spelled long-term doom to the Republic. Lenin, of course, thought he knew best, and was the only one who stood for the revolution, and never wanted checks and balances, and it became just as corrupt as you would imagine. Add the special perks, being part of the party, and it just became a cesspool in spite of all the great ideas, and up to 20 million lives were just wasted in the process, because a tiny elite of people decided everything, did everything heavy-handed, and tried things that were never tried before in the worst ways possible. Add to this that many of the elites were viewed with contempt as the bourgeois if they had any degree or education, and so they had even less knowledge to pull from to attempt something this huge, and it failed miserably. I will not be redoing the next two videos, but an additional note I will add on there is that Stalin used the same method to crush elites and educate it even worse, and got even worse results out of it. He also got into power because of all the greedy, power-hungry people joining the party for perks, and Stalin was in the department to hire and fire, so they were 100% loyal to him. Stalin, once seizing power, then used the same show trial tactics on all the former revolutionaries who could have claimed any competing legitimacy to being Lenin's heir, and every major revolutionary ended up murdered and utterly humiliated in show trials, giving forced confessions via torture and threats to their families' lives. In the end, the only one true leader was Stalin, just like the Tsars, and he gave the Tsars a run for their money in incompetence and cruelty. To be honest, it's really hard to discover the truth about socialism, communism, and anarchism. Both the capitalists and the communists use propaganda, each biased in favor of their side and very uncharitable to the other side, often not representing them or their arguments as the other side sees it. Pretty much always a straw man. If I have said anything that you can debunk, please let me know, and if it's dramatic enough, I will upload a new video to cover it. So as always, thank you all for watching this as a video or listening to this as a podcast, which I'm sure was completely uncontroversial to anyone, especially to the YouTube monetization team. So if you found this useful, please donate to my Patreon. Just a reminder that I'm Anubis2814 on YouTube, and I have almost 700 videos on my channel that I've made over the past 11 years on religion, science, psychology, and politics. Please go check them out, and if your site has the option, like, rate, review, and comment. A special thanks goes out to Kendall Copperberg, Ogrel, Elias Garcia Guevara, and Joe Taylor for their $10 or more Wapawet level donations. I'm always humbled by the fact that they find my work worth funding and worth driving me forward. Thank you all. Please consider donating to my work if you can, and thank you all for listening.